Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming. I'm David Gersten, the Director of Arts, Letters, and Numbers. And I want to welcome you all to our conversation today with Don't Delete Art. And first, I want to welcome our three speakers today, Emma Shapiro, Elizabeth Larson, and Ella Chapman. Very happy to have you here. And very happy to have Don't Delete Art. I think, art, it's an important campaign. Don't Delete Art is a resource center. It's an online gallery, and it's exposing the issue of art censorship on social media. And it's fighting for greater representation of artistic perspectives in content moderation. It was created in 2020. Don't Delete Art, the coalition includes the National Coalition Against Censorship, Free Muse, and PEN America's Artist at Risk Connection. And Don't Delete Art has a manifesto, and it is calling for signatures from artists, art lovers, organizations, institutions to pressure social media companies to do better by artists and protect creative expression on social media. And I just wanted to add, I'm very moved that we're having this conversation here today with Arts, Letters, and Numbers. This is clearly an increasingly crucial subject. Free expression in all of its forms is under attack. And in some very old ways that we've seen for decades, if not centuries, and in some completely new ways. As power in all of its fixed and frightened forms relentlessly attempts to construct and control a narrative of life, the arts in all of their forms are providing oxygen to our social exchanges. Through many forms of expression, art resists these hegemonic forces that seek to control life. And as these battle lines shift, we must continuously adjust and buttress free expression. And this is what Don't Delete Art is doing. So I want to thank you for the work you're doing. And I want to thank you for being here today. And now I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much for that passionate introduction, David, and for the invitation, Steve and David, to be here. Ella, why don't we get the screen up? Great. So as we begin, I just want to say, if you have any questions as we speak, feel free to enter them into the chat. We'll be sharing some images later on of some artworks that have been censored. If there are any thoughts that cross your mind as these come across the screen, feel free to pop those into the chat as well. I am the director of the Arts and Culture Advocacy Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship. For those of you who've never heard of NCAC before, we are a coalition of about 59 member organizations promoting freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression. And our Arts and Culture Advocacy Program, the one that I oversee, is the only national project dedicated to supporting artists in censorship disputes and advocating for audiences to be able to access the work of artists. A big part of the work that we do in the Arts and Culture Advocacy Program is with Don't Delete Art and advocating for artistic expression online. Very briefly, as David mentioned, DDA is a collaboration between NCAC, the Artists at Risk Connection, Free Muse, as well as artist activists Savannah Spirit, Spencer Tunick, and Emma Shapiro. Together, we focus on issues of artistic expression on social media, where it's being suppressed and why, and work to advocate to make sure that artists are able to share their work online. Before we go any further, I'll turn it over to Emma.
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you so much, David and Steve and Arts, Letters, and Numbers for inviting us to speak. I'll repeat what Elizabeth just said. I'm especially interested in doing this here with you all because I'm a former resident of Arts, Letters, and Numbers. I was a resident with them in 2015, and it was an incredible experience, quite pivotal for me in my practice and very important. And the artwork that I was working on then and continued to work on afterwards is the same artwork that ultimately was facing art censorship issues, content moderation issues online and in real life. But that's what led me into becoming an advocate for artists who are facing issues on social media with exposing their work and being able to achieve success. So I am now, I'm a practicing artist. I am the editor at large for the Don't Delete Art campaign, and I co-write the newsletter with Savannah Spirit. And I am also an art writer. I publish with Hyperallergic, the art newspaper, and a few other publications. So thank you all so much.
Before we dive into the reasons why certain artistic expression might be moderated out of social media platforms or downranked, it will be good to review just basically what the legal parameters are for social media companies. What are their rights to moderate? In the mid-1990s, the Communications Decency Act was passed, and importantly, a part of it called Section 230, which does two important things. One is that it recognizes the First Amendment rights of social media companies to moderate content and create rules for participating in their forums. This is a completely necessary part of making the internet what we know it is today, places that are sort of functional and usable and accessible. Of course, not perfectly, but without the ability of social media companies to moderate, it would be a totally different field. Additionally, what Section 230 does is it makes it so that social media companies are not responsible or liable for the third-party content that users might share or create on these platforms. This was decided in part because it helps preserve the freedom of speech of the users of social media, because if there's any possibility of these social media companies being concerned about lawsuits, or if they're responsible for what's being shared online, from a legal perspective, they're going to err on the side of caution and not allow various kinds of speech on internet and social media. So this part of Section 230, even though it sort of alleviates social media companies from being liable, it also does so with the intent of protecting the free speech among the users. There are a few exceptions to that rule, namely in terms of copyright, and more recently around sex trafficking and sesta fosta, which Emma will talk about in a little bit. Though this year, the Supreme Court will be determining the limits of Section 230 and a series of high-profile cases. So be on the lookout for that. It may impact the field of the internet as we know it. But the unique conditions provided by Section 230 means that social media companies are basically operating in uncharted territory. They're not quite like a newspaper, they're not quite like a bookstore in terms of what they're responsible for and moderating, but also in the volume and the scope of the content that they're sharing. It's completely unprecedented. As a result, much of their moderating happens in a trial and error basis. And we've seen this over the years, where there used to be wholesale bans on photographic nudity on social media, whereas over time, they've allowed some exceptions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So I just want to say that NCAC and DDA both have spoken in favor of social media companies' right to moderate. It's necessary and it's important. But we do take issue with the applications and the implementations of some of that moderation, particularly when it comes to the suppression of artistic expression. If we could go to the next one. So as we begin, I just want to give a brief background to the origins of DDA before we get going. In the late 2010s, there was an increasing awareness of problems of artistic censorship on social media, particularly in relation to artworks that depicted nudity. Notably, there was one really egregious error that happened multiple times in 2018, when images of the Venus of Willendorf, which is a Stone Age sculpture of a nude female form, were erroneously taken off of Facebook because they allegedly violated the content policies. And I say this erroneously because in relation to nude art, Instagram or Meta only prohibits posts of what they refer to as real nude adults. This means that with the exception of issues of like post-operations, post-mastectomies, post-birth, breastfeeding, and protest. But this means that lens-based artworks like photography, film and video, uses of photographic collage, these are held to a higher standard and treated differently than other forms of artwork, such as drawings, paintings, and sculpture, if they depict nude bodies. And the realm of the arts in particular, this is a huge issue. As you may know, the human body has been a source of inspiration and expressed in artistic forms for tens of thousands of years. So this is something that we were, artists and NCAC were paying attention to. And in 2019, NCAC collaborated with photographer Spencer Tunick to organize a protest around these policies through a public nude installation called We the Nipple. It took place outside of Facebook headquarters and drew attention to artistic censorship of nude images. I mention this because after this particular action, Facebook invited 20 artists and NCAC to meet with them to discuss various policies. And while change has been slow and incremental, this was an important starting point for us to realize that for any changes to happen, pressure had to be sustained and long-term. So DDA was then formed, as David mentioned, in 2020, when the National Coalition Against Censorship convened arts organizations, human rights organizations, arts collectors, and artists around the shared understanding that suppression of artistic expression on social media was a problem, because social media is arguably one of the most accessible ways for artists to share their work and find patrons. As David mentioned, the DDA is composed of NCAC, Artists at Risk Connection, Free Muse, and artist activists Savannah Spirit, Spencer Tunick, and Emma Shapiro. And the decision to make DDA a collaboration among multiple organizations and individuals is a strategic one. Various arts and human rights organizations have established resources, of course, but oftentimes censorship on social media might just be one part of a broader picture of different issues that they address. And similarly, artist activists are the ones who are most frequently censored. They are typically able to identify and demonstrate specific issues of censorship online and firsthand. And so their involvement is super important as we determine our initiatives and the directions that they take. Now, I guess we can start by taking a look at some of the content that we see that gets removed, in particular, how its interpretation by artificial intelligence and platform guidelines infuses it with other types of meanings than what they might intend.
And we welcome you
Great.
to make comments about what your perception of this work is, if you're surprised that this is work that was removed from social media, et cetera.
Absolutely. Thanks, Emma. As I mentioned before, most nudity and lens-based works constitute the majority of the censorship complaints that we see. The majority of censorship reports that we get at DDA come from Instagram users, because by far that is where artists tend to post online and share their work. And Emma, if you want to continue.
Yep, well, so as was seen with the We the Nipple protests, the most well-known and notorious content moderation issue that artists face is the female nipple ban. There's a lot of activists and educators and artists who speak out against this particular ban and talk about how it affects their practice, but to artists, it's an especially annoying issue. Just about all social media companies follow the same logic as, say, Meta does when it comes to the nipple, or the female nipple, and the nude body, which is that a female nipple is nudity and nudity is sexual activity. Most all guidelines for social media companies and platforms have a section that is adult nudity and sexual activity. And underneath that heading would be how they deal with nude bodies. And bans on female nipples means that the female presenting form is twice as likely to be removed than the male presenting form, simply because the nipples are female presenting or identified as such by AI algorithms and human moderators. So, but there, as was mentioned before, also there are certain instances in which a female presenting nipple is allowed, and those have been hard-won arguments over the years. They weren't originally in the concepts of community guidelines, but they came after protests and activism, and that includes breastfeeding, post-mastectomy scarring, breast cancer imagery, and forms of protest, though of course a lot of those images do get mistakenly removed as well. Don't delete art. We have a part of our website where we have tips for artists and how to self-censor or obscure nipples, other like genitals, all the different kinds of things in an image that could get a post removed. So that's something that has been compiled over time with advice from artists and from personal experience, as well as input from Meta at times. So you might be familiar most recently with the female nipple ban because it became pretty mainstream recently when Meta's oversight board released their decision on adult nudity and gender identity, which took Meta to account for removing images of trans and non-binary creators. The decision particularly focused on the implications of gendering and targeting nipples for deletion. What they stated within their decision was, Meta's policies on adult nudity result in greater barriers to expression for women, trans, and gender non-binary people on its platforms. And they recommended that Meta ensure equal treatment of all people that is consistent with international human rights standards and avoid discrimination on the basis of sex or gender identity. This went a very long way to confirm what many creators and artists on Instagram believed for a very long time, that targeting female presenting bodies is discriminatory. However, don't be fooled by a lot of the headlines that you've seen saying that Instagram's going to free the nipple and the nipple is free on Instagram, because that just is not the case. Instagram and Meta has until March 17th to respond to the Oversight Board's recommendations, but the recommendations didn't even ask them to free the nipple. So we're not in the clear yet on that. I guess we can move on to the next slides. So in around March 2021, we at Don't Delete Art started seeing a rise in reports and art removal with the implementation of a new violation on the platform called adult sexual solicitation. And the introduction of this violation meant that platforms like Instagram were wiping content off their platforms that could even be tangentially understood as sexual or illicit. So whereas before, art might be removed for going against guidelines for nudity, now instead, images are being taken down that maybe didn't even have nudity in them, or the nudity was self-censored out, and they were being judged for being sexual solicitation. Unsurprisingly, this has had its greatest impact on women, BIPOC creators, and other marginalized creators. So why did they suddenly implement this? Well, Instagram's decisions about this are greatly informed by what Elizabeth mentioned earlier, the 2018 laws known as SESTA-FOSTA. They're intended to curb sex trafficking and child sex abuse imagery online. So SESTA and FOSTA were passed to modify the existing Section 230 protections. That the modification means that this means that these platforms, which were once protected from prosecution under Section 230, are now liable for the content posted by users that contain sex trafficking imagery, child sex abuse imagery. So the threat of litigation that these sites could then be brought to court over images that their users posted, that really spooked them. And so they started purging any content that could possibly be perceived as child sex abuse imagery or sex trafficking imagery. So while these laws were intended to inhibit sex trafficking and sex abuse imagery of children online, it appears that they've had the opposite effect. There's a lot of studies about this, and it's made abuse actually harder to track and has pushed sex workers back into unsafe environments. The sex work and fine art communities don't often visibly overlap, but the growing threat to both became clear when artists started receiving this particular notification, sexual solicitation. Artists who perhaps had previously run afoul of Instagram's notorious guidelines were understandably confused and offended to have their work not only overtly sexualized, but accused of breaking the law. This moment of discrimination against both artists and sex workers shows us how vulnerable we all are to prejudicial policies and legal missteps and misapplication of laws. What is happening to sex workers and artists online is one and the same, fostered by ignorance and judgment and bolstered by a lack of nuance. Laws designed to fight against sex trafficking and child sex abuse imagery should not be what limits the success of countless creators who have a right to bodily autonomy and expression online.
Something that we regularly face, or a challenge we regularly face as we talk about these issues on social media, who artistic suppression is affecting the most, which groups of artists it affects the most, has to do with the fact that we have such limited access to the actual data that social media companies have about what posts sort of trigger the algorithms as being potentially sexual content, or and so on and so forth, because these social media companies have little incentive to collect, analyze, and share the data, right? It also makes it all the more important to document when artists say they're facing censorship. And something that we've suspected for a long time was, as Emma mentioned, artists are telling us, particularly, I'll say non-male artists, non-straight artists, are suspecting that part of their work is often being censored because of the images of women or non-binary artists or LGBTQ communities that might trigger, part of these algorithms, trigger the censorship. But something this was just affirmed just a few months ago in a study by The Guardian of AI systems. And it showed that something that, as we suspected, AI algorithms are likely to view women's bodies as more racy than men's bodies. A picture of women on the beach in bathing suits will be seen as more racy than those of men in bathing suits on the beach, and so on and so forth. So the study concluded that social media companies are employing these AI systems or ones similar to them, and are likely suppressing or downranking and shadow banning images of women's bodies, which will hurt not just female creators or non-binary creators, but the businesses that they run and their own exposure and ability to sort of express their perspectives. And I should say, I don't think I mentioned this, that the AI systems that were reviewed in this Google article are among the most, from the biggest and most well-funded companies, Google and Microsoft. So it's a really fascinating article. If you haven't read it, do look. It's really just astounding. They have an image of a live image of one of their writers who is a male who is just standing shirtless, and it has a live read of how the algorithm is perceiving his body. And the moment he picks up like an article of clothing that's like a bra or something, immediately the raciness of the image goes up 100%. So it's something that there's not a lot of information about, and the importance of these studies is tantamount as we go forward. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And also, in almost all of these cases, the artists that come to us reporting censorship are artists who are lesser known. And this is incredibly important to note, that there are so many artworks in the art historical canon, which include nudes and which were racy in their times. And there might be, we might be able to sort of dismiss like the L'Origine du Monde, a close-up painting of a crotch, essentially, or Robert Mapplethorpe, who was very racy in his time and still is to some degree. But we accept the images and the document, like the communities that he documented, as part of art now, and it's easy for us to recognize that. But that same sort of recognition is so much less likely to be extended to artists who are working now, who are creating work now, who have yet to be recognized in all of the world's great museums and art history textbooks. And that's part of the reason of why we feel the work that we're doing at DDA is so important. So the primary reports that we get to DDA are from these first two categories of artworks that depict the nude body or that are confused with sexual solicitation. But art is suppressed for many other reasons too, some of which are hard to comprehend. The algorithms are not always able to distinguish certain contexts that might help identify a work's meaning, message, or content as belonging to a status of art, and might instead categorize them as violating community guidelines against and might categorize them as violating community guidelines in reference to things like drug trafficking or hate speech or violence, terrorism, and so forth. Art is also misread systemically. It's important for social media companies to be able to tag and read art and teach the algorithms to read certain images as art. And this is why it's so important to include artists in that conversation. Artists are comprise a very small part, and some would say maybe a non-existent part of the digital rights community. So as we go forward, this is something very important. That's very important to keep in mind. Another issue that we see in this sort of category of censorship includes government-sanctioned suppression of specific messages or types of art on social media. Freedom of expression, as we know, varies from country to country. And as the Santa Clara Principles state, the Santa Clara Principles, by the way, are a list of free expression guidelines compiled by digital rights and human rights professionals. And they're directed both to guide governments and social media companies. The Santa Clara Principles makes these recommendations that users should know when a state actor has requested or participated in the actioning of any of their content or on their account. They also state that users should know if the company believes that the actioning was required by relevant law and so forth. Just because these Santa Clara Principles exist as guidelines does not mean that social media companies are going to adopt them or are adopting them, but they're particularly around issues of free speech as they change in different contexts around the world. The Santa Clara Principles provide wonderful guidelines for how social media companies should navigate working with governments and the type of transparency that should be around related actionings on the accounts.
So yeah, this is a very important issue, and to repeat what Elizabeth said, most of the artists that reach out to us are, of course, they're dealing with the nudity guidelines, but that doesn't mean that artists are not being suppressed around the world on social media for other reasons. Their issues might not be getting to our desk because they are not existent on social media anymore. They cannot reach us. Actual lives are at risk for the kind of artwork that people post to social media. And Free Muse is one of our coalition members, the Don't Delete Art Coalition, and they publish a yearly State of Artistic Freedom report. And in their 2022 State of Artistic Freedom, they open it with the following sentence: "The state of freedom of expression globally was considered by rights monitors to be at its lowest point in recent years." So there has definitely been a rise in digital threats against artistic freedom from governments employing cyber troopers who target artists by reporting their accounts until they're removed, to doxing of artists and harassment culminating in life-threatening circumstances. Digital attacks on artists are a serious red flag that often goes ignored. Fake news laws, for example, which are often used to ban anything a partisan government determines to share false information, is predictably used to silence critical art. For example, Bolsonaro's government created online networks to track down fake news, which were soon used for harassment campaigns and censorship of artists. So while women artists are especially targeted online with harassment, abuse, and algorithmic bias, LGBTQ artists are especially likely to be made public examples of by conservative governments and regimes. Social media has persisted as a space for marginalized groups to find community and expression, but that is less the case when governments start to use it against them. We can move on to the next one, Ellen. Okay, are we there? No.
Are we?
The one before, sorry.
Yeah, that quotes page.
Yes. Here we will in a moment, you'll get to read some more quotes from the artists that are represented in the Don't Delete Art Gallery. They provide us with their stories and of what censorship of their artwork on social media felt like to them and the circumstances. And so we've been keeping track, and their powerful words are just really say enough. So going off of these quotes that you have right before you, it's important to say that the ripple effect of art censorship on social media is very deep and very wide. And as we've seen through various studies, the creators most affected by biased content moderation are creators already in marginalized communities, like disabled creators, LGBTQIA creators, BIPOC, and women creators. So therefore, it should come as no surprise that the artists most affected would also fall into those categories. To survive on the platform, artists must navigate slippery logic through self-censorship and altered art practices, possibly even changing the landscape of the art world itself. So many artists, including Don't Delete Art's Savannah Spirit, have deliberately altered their practice and the kind of work they make to try to slip past censors and show their work online. The logic being, it's better to be seen doing something similar to what you want to do than to not be seen at all, to have no presence online. So what might be the after effects of that kind of adjustment? Not only are we missing what these artists have originally produced, but now we are seeing art that is made specifically with social media moderation in mind. Artists need a platform to be seen. Before Instagram, that platform was usually the exhibition space, and of course it still is. Integral to the existence and success of art that pushes boundaries, powerful exhibitions naturally pull together artists who are speaking on provocative themes. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the exhibitions that are facing censorship are those that are tackling themes of representation, identity, disability, abortion, sexuality, all rights that are under threat and on the debate table, and therefore they're fertile ground for artists. The continuation of a certain kind of vision of what art is and can be is not just limiting, but detrimental to the art world. Naturally, artists who are challenging notions or concepts such as the male gaze and traditional art forms represent a needed and natural progression of art history. But if the main medium in which art travels sifts out these visions via censorship or shadow banning, we're doomed to continue in the same patriarchal, privileged systems that we deserve to leave behind. A pointed note, because women's nipples are a particularly pointy issue on social media, artists who are challenging gender norms and representing other perspectives of the female presenting body are often unable to share their work and their world and to succeed in this very important tool, which is social media. Social media tends to exclude bare buttocks, genitals, and female nipples. This means that women are twice as likely as men to be censored, which I'll repeat. And still, the anxiety of censorship is a looming presence on social media, and one that continues to grow. Censored artists not only lose the opportunity to share their work, they lose the chance to be promoted by an art world also hindered by this anxiety. Often missing are the voices of galleries and art institutions who also must navigate these same restrictions when promoting exhibitions. It's very worrisome, and one can't help but conclude that if a gallery can't promote an exhibition on social media because of the work that it includes, then they may be apt to not include that kind of artwork in future exhibitions. The future of social media is changing, and Meta, for example, is investing heavily in the metaverse and Web3 technology. So if their current limitations on what counts as art mean that some artists can't partake in these new opportunities, it also means that Meta would be advancing from limiting artists' reach on social media to barring them from actively engaging in major aspects of the art market, like NFTs. As digital rights groups are monitoring social media companies and pushing for better practices and pushing them to adhere to human rights standards, visual artists are often missing from that conversation. The Santa Clara Principles, which Elizabeth mentioned earlier, and which Don't Delete Art points to in our manifesto, they were created without consulting artists. But this is not exactly entirely the fault of these digital rights groups for not approaching artists to be part of the process. It's also on the art world for not stepping forward and saying, we deserve a seat at this table too. We're worried about how art is being treated online and on social media. We're worried about what this means for artists in the future. So the art world often neglects to take social media seriously enough and doesn't demand that seat at the table and doesn't step up for the communities, for their art community that's suffering. That's why we really urge that art institutions read our manifesto as well. We would love to see art institutions stepping forward on behalf of the artists that they ought to represent.
And with that, we come back to Don't Delete Art and the ways that we try to respond to all of these issues that we're pointing to, right? We have our gallery, which works as a place to showcase and document works that have been censored online. If you or somebody you know have been censored online, you can go to our website and click the button that says Report Censorship. That will allow you to submit an image and the story of your censorship as part of our sort of research repository of images. We also, as Emma mentioned, have tips, which is a section on our website, identifying what artists need to do to fight censorship, to keep them aware of what the latest policies are and how to deal with them. How can you, what are the modes to censor your own work so that it can be shown on social media and so forth. We also have our newsletter and blog to track recent developments and discussions around issues of censorship on social media. And then of course, is our campaign and manifesto, which we just launched in February, which now has over 1,000 signatures. If you've signed already, thank you so much. And if you haven't yet, please take a look and join us. It's so important for us to convey this message to these social media companies because of their unprecedented control over what's happening and what's being shared in these creative communities. We are demanding not just more human review, but we're calling for the inclusion, as Emma said, of artists in these digital rights conversations. We also want social media companies to stand by their own rules. There are many situations in which AI erroneously reads various images, and we need greater accountability for that and so much more. So if I believe that link will be shared in the chat if it hasn't already. And part of what we're trying to do with this manifesto is bring all these voices together, right? So many times censorship sort of happens in these siloized circumstances. A gallery might try to share an image, but it gets blocked and then they pick another one. End of story, they move on. So many artists, like as Emma said, have altered their practices to meet these standards. But without coming together, these voices and these experiences can just be sort of obliterated. And then we have a creative field which is made more unequal based off of what is able to be shared in this very important platform. And so with the manifesto, our goal has been to really bring together all of these voices, including, but not limited to, artists, people who teach in the arts, other curators and arts workers, along with, and most importantly, in some respects, these institutions which have yet to really to bring their voice together, which is why it's so fantastic that Arts, Letters, and Numbers is one of the few arts institutions so far to join on, and hopefully the first of many hundreds. We'll be pushing for that this week. We just got recent coverage in the Arts newspaper and a few more smaller publications today. So the word is spreading, the momentum is building, and we've been grateful for all the support we've had so far. With that, I think that concludes our presentation part of today's talk. If there are any questions, we can begin taking them.
I have just a bit of an observation, and you did touch on this, and I think it maybe goes without saying, but it's an interesting examination of how AI and culture relate, the relationship between the two, the functioning of AI as a byproduct of culture, or to what extent is it that, or to what extent is it getting to learn about AI in the modern cultural context, comparing old cultural broad brush behaviors or broad brush dictums about the feminine, and then cultural responses accordingly over hundreds of years would be reflected of that. And now with the development of AI, to what extent is it serving the current cultural context, or to what extent is it just serving what it's programmed to observe, and therefore it's not to blame per se, it's just, or maybe even it wasn't necessarily even designed for that purpose, it's just a byproduct of programming. Delicate, I don't know the answer to the question.
Well, you bring up a really important point. Particularly, I'm thinking about this Guardian article, which I mentioned briefly. One of the AI experts interviewed in this article starts to investigate or explore the idea of where do these image assessments come from? How is AI created? Well, the AI learns from user data input, or research data input, however you want to think of it. But there are real humans who are helping code these code images, or similar images, so that the computer AI can learn from these image assessments. And this can all be very subjective. Who is providing this data? Who is reading these images and giving these parameters for machines to then learn from? Many times, well, I can't say, I haven't looked at the data, I don't have the data, but this computer scientist alludes to the fact that it's likely colored by the fact that there are many men who are coding these images. And depending on their cultural context, seeing a woman in the gym might be more racy in certain contexts around the world than it is in others. And so there hasn't been a total public assessment of how this data is compiled, how certain people are brought in to review such images. But it all comes from somewhere, right? It doesn't just come from nowhere. Like the products of AI are in part in line with the challenges and follies of humanity as well. So it's an important question, and how we can improve AI to maybe where must it take into consideration various human perspectives, but also how can it know the full gamut if we're not providing it with that type of data?
A couple of thoughts I wanted to share. First of all, thank you. As I was listening to the details, I couldn't help but think of the Port Huron Statement, 1962. Tom Hayden. I guess this was a different era, maybe I'm old, but this was a manifesto put out by the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, in 1962, and it was really a kind of crucial moment and it was addressing a lot of large social, economic, political injustice, and also an earlier version of what you are battling, which is McCarthyism. The sort of incredible, chilling impact that McCarthy and that whole regime of censorship and oppression had on an entire generation, and so I think the Port Huron Statement is a kind of earlier predecessor to the DDA manifesto, and part of what's interesting in that is if you think about control societies, or societies of control and regimes of controlling behavior, all of this we've seen for centuries in different forms, and then we think of the regimes of AI as a McCarthyism of today, and of course they're not. It's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because of the political times that we live in. I mean, AI is, and in fact, part of why I'm excited about what you're doing is, the regimes of AI are quickly, as you might well know, extremely quickly becoming the apparatus through which many different forms of politics can take hold. And of course, if you look around the world, there are lots of different forms of violence that, and lots of different regimes that are using AI as an apparatus of control. And of course, so here we're looking at, giant capital, right? Meta and its 50 cousins, deploying this regime with this kind of completely, non-credible argument that it's somehow neutral. That AI, it's just nonsense. I mean, it's an absurd argument to make. It's sort of like saying the police are neutral. They're implementing a very specific politics and violence when it comes to controlling a society. And in this case, AI becomes a form of police, a form of intrusion on people's private and public lives. And so I do think there's a danger that we face, which is the false neutrality of AI somehow. And then of course, it's so obvious, right? The immediate link to like sex trafficking and child abuse. Also, it's the exact same kind of language that was used by McCarthy and his 50 cousins. Over the years, everybody has always built the boogeyman as the reason that they had to control people's behavior, because otherwise, oh my God, and so we do, it's all very quickly happening, right? Very quickly, this second world that we live in between us, social media, is being absorbed into regimes of control that have a very specific agenda of capitalism. I mean, there's no, it's not, it doesn't take that much to recognize that the instruments of authority, authorship and authority, right? We can never forget authority and authorship, right? They're directly implicated. And I've often said, power, it has a tendency. It's like water goes downhill, right? Gravity does certain things. Power, in various ways, will always author a story of the present that buttresses its authority to do so, buttresses its authority to be the author, right? To remain in control. And sometimes that's editing out and removing things as not part of the story. And as you importantly pointed out, the self-censorship is not only the result, it's the intent. Creating the inner self-censorship, right? Obviously, what McCarthy and them were doing, or we can name 30 other regimes since, was trying to create the self-censorship. And there's no question that that's what's happening here. It isn't a byproduct, it's the product to get people to be afraid of their bodies and be afraid of the expression of themselves and all of those things. And so when I say buttress its authority to do so, meaning it maintains capital and its AI, police, maintain their authority to be the authors, to control the narrative and to determine what is evil, what is bad, what is dangerous, and so yeah, the battle lines are shifting very, very quickly, and I think I mean, I just was thinking like the nipple thing. I was thinking, it's really just like the tip of the iceberg.
The nip of the iceberg.
The nip of the iceberg, in terms of the fascism and the hegemony that is deeply embedded in all of this. So
I mean, yeah, exactly. And I also want to note that like instances of topless sunbathing in Europe have decreased in recent years. And when asked about it, sunbathers point mostly to social media and them worrying that an image will get placed on social media, or that they'll post something and then their account will be taken down. Doesn't have to do with like, skin cancer or anything like that. So it's just cultures like Spain where I live, or like say Sweden, who they have a very egalitarian system of how they deal with, bodies. They're being influenced by social media coming from the United States. And it's very widely understood that, oh yeah, well, the Americans have a very puritanistic point of view and that we're being fed that, but it's ultimately affecting their decisions. So yeah, it's a shame. I think that's why the nipple is one of my main focuses as an activist, because it represents just so much about control over the body.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We got a question in the chat that was similar to one that was one of the pre-questions in the pre-questionnaire that we had. And the question from Clive is, why are we still using social media companies that block or delete our work? Is it not time to look for or create a platform by artists for artists? This is something that, I've personally heard a lot, and it's a constant ring that happens on social media among artists who are being hurt. It's let's get out of here. Let's create our own thing. We need our own thing. And unfortunately, it's just not that simple. And I've come to believe that, it's my duty as an artist, as somebody with a female presenting body and somebody who cares about this issue and talks to a lot of other people who care, for us to push Meta, for example, to do better, because the influence that they have is so massive that we need to make our voices heard. That, and as an artist, we could run the risk of just, preaching to the choir and working in our own echo chamber. Social media platforms give us access to all different kinds of users and all different patrons and opportunities and museums and news, that a site that would just be for artists probably wouldn't have all that engagement.
Yeah, not to mention, of course, the existing social media sites are they're massive, they're very well funded, have staffing and, systems in place beyond what I think a new kind of platform would really require to be successful. And just as you say, Emma, the fact that it's a cross-pollination of all kinds of audiences, general audiences, if you have like a network which is only targeting people who are looking for art, you sort of miss that opportunity for other people to stumble across it. And that's the most beautiful thing about, artistic expression, is that, you find that it has relevance and meaning, and sometimes places where you don't always look for it. And this is, I think it's an important way just to important reason to keep fighting for representation on these existing platforms. Not to say that new ones won't come up or new ones might not be better, but yeah, this is why our focus is here right now.
I think it also speaks to the whether you love him or hate him, now Elon Musk and his arguments for his taking over of Twitter. His argument was that it's a public square. Ultimately, these social platforms are intended, at least in the rhetoric, to be a space of a public forum where people should be able to voice their opinions and voice their ideas, and then let the public process determine the truth through dialogue, rather than having, as Dave was saying, the authorship of what is quote unquote right or wrong this year. to determine what we're allowed to say and not say this year, right? So by pushing them, I think your mission is apt in the sense where you're pushing for the ability to speak freely and express freely within a public square, not on a website per se.
Yeah, there's some parts of that which I think are worth holding close. This, you know, the importance of expression. At the same time, the types of things that I think Elon Musk was speaking out against are, in terms of social media companies being able to moderate, are things that we actually at the NCAC are in support of, and we're not the only ones. Like many digital rights organizations, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Center for Democracy and Technology, these social media companies wouldn't work without content moderation. They would quickly devolve into pits of like pornography and violence and just completely unwelcoming environments that nobody would want to be on them anymore. So there is a balance here. We do think that social media companies do have the right to moderate. So it's not quite a public square in that same sense. You know, they have the right to kind of keep their own financial interests in mind. You know, if their company is going to go down the tank because they can't attract people to it because it's rife with all sorts of unpleasantries, then they're completely restricted, and then they have no sort of right to navigate and make their platform what they want it to be or what they think it should be. So there's a balance here, but hopefully what was been demonstrated in some of the works that we've shown, there's artwork that's being downranked, shadow banned, suppressed, removed because of misreadings, because of sort of false comparisons with illegal activity, and that's what we need greater. We need social media companies to do better, and we have some suggestions for how that can happen. But the most important thing is for artists and people from the arts community to join that conversation so that the moderation can happen better. So the moderation can include the interests of artists and the cultural community at large.
So can I ask you then, Elizabeth, what if, you know, we have likely artists within our audience here, what should an artist do, or what can we do as a community to share, not only just share the word and sign a manifesto, but how does that look on the day-to-day?
I think to be part of the conversation, and certainly Emma join into with thoughts, following Don't Delete Art on social media, and for instances of censorship on social media, and follow NCAC for issues of censorship more broadly, but being aware of what's going on and looking to resources which regularly report on this stuff. DDA has an amazing newsletter which comes out about once a month. Savannah Spirit and Emma do a lot of work on that to bring a lot of the most pressing issues and updates that are kind of happening in the field, and speaking out about it. But for finding information about censorship, of course, the DDA website has a lot of information, but I think keeping track of these things, for example, I think it's the oversight board that has these regular like emailings, or like they might have periods where they take comment from the public in terms of how they assess certain issues that are coming up or that they're reconsidering. Following places like the oversight board and making sure that you're aware of the next public comment, which they've covered various issues, particularly I think trans representation on social media and so forth. And of course, signing the manifesto, sharing it with your friends. The more voices we can bring to this particular action, the greater impact we will have. 1,000 signatures is great, and we're very excited about it, but we know in the big picture that's just a drop in the bucket for many of these companies, which is why it's so important to keep pushing. We see this as just being in the very beginning stages of this particular campaign. And to continue that momentum, we just need the investment, we need the attention, we need the commitment of artists to understand that this also impacts them, even if they don't even work with nudes, even if they don't work with anything that could be remotely perceived as sexually solicitous. This is the freedom of expression of artists, which is being completely overwritten by very, very powerful companies that don't totally know what they're doing in all instances. So they need us, they need our voices. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. You know, I second all of that. And I would just empower all artists and all people on social media to occupy this space, you know, just recognize that, yeah, you are important to this conversation, and especially artists who have experienced some kind of content moderation that they feel was wrong, or that they feel like their posts are being suppressed because of the artwork that they're posting. It's a very lonely experience, and you can be easily guided to feel like you did something wrong. I mean, that's what they want you to feel, and so because they want you to stop doing it. And it's important to know that there is a community out there of artists who are still learning about this, who don't have all the details that the people who are leading Don't Delete Art, have at our fingertips. You know, we are here as a resource to show you what we've learned, to share with you how you should feel empowered to speak out for yourself and say, you know, that isn't right. Like, I'm an artist, that was art. Like, why am I not allowed to share that with my community? Why am I being suppressed just because of the artwork that I'm making or the imagery that I'm choosing to show in my artwork? I have a right to freedom of expression, and how can I make sure that that's protected? The more voices we have, we need every single voice.
And you also have the right to view it, even if it isn't your post, right?
Mhm.
Ultimately. And I
Absolutely.
really appreciate the idea that you mentioned with the community. You know, the inclination to not share something for fear of being expelled from the group, that's a natural human inclination. And this has been touched on in a number of different ways in the talk. Self-censorship, as Dave said, is that's ultimately the motivation for the purpose of the fear of being an alien. And knowing that there is a community there and sharing. So one thing that we can do is share obviously what you're doing now is share the idea that there is a community. So by joining a community, you're more likely and more apt to perhaps buttress another one, or push against the other community with less fear of isolation.
Absolutely. And I don't think that social media companies, I don't think they know what they're doing in this realm, you know, and I think that the more voices we can bring together, the more of a clamor we can make, that they don't want to be perceived as suppressing the rights of artists. They don't want to be perceived as suppressing artistic expression. So they just need to know that this is an issue, and certainly they have resources to help develop better ways to address this. Even if we don't know in every single case what those solutions are, number one is to make sure that artists are in the room, that artists can help give feedback to help the programming of algorithms to identify certain artistic contexts. I don't have all the answers, but these are important starting points that we need to be in the room.
Yes, exactly.
And
Simple as that.
it goes a little back to the idea that I mentioned before. To what extent is this culture, and to what extent is just trying to figure it all out? A system that was designed, and now we're just got to manipulate it a bit to make it smarter.
Absolutely. And then in the coming months this year, I know I mentioned Section 230. I won't go into any detail at all, but pay attention into the news. There are two cases that are coming to the Supreme Court this year. Both involve instances of terrorism. So, you know, to what extent are social media companies liable for terrorists using, you know, their platforms for sharing information, for recommending content? These two cases have a lot. I think Twitter versus Tomney and Gonzalez versus Google. They stand to, depending on how the Supreme Court decides, might greatly shift the field as we know it. And so a lot of people who are paying attention to digital rights issues are watching this. And while it doesn't automatically include anything about the arts in it, the implications, of course, extend to this, because there may be a chilling of expression based on the decisions of either of these two cases. So yeah, keep paying attention and keep following the leadership of organizations and individuals who are watching these issues and be part of the pressure to push back and keep clamoring for what we need in the arts community.
Yes, and it isn't just what's happening in the United States. This is a growing movement across the globe for the effort to regulate social media platforms and the internet to respond to these issues of, say, terrorism, human sex trafficking, etc. And the EU, the UK, the United States have all been proposing laws, implementing laws that affect the way that the internet functions. And it's important to keep an eye on that if you can, or just be aware that this is something that is happening beyond the borders of the United States as well. People are they're not trying to hurt the arts, but in the process, there can be major chilling of expression on the part of these companies who are just trying to protect themselves. So.
You know, I know I'm going to say something that sounds like a very ancient thing relative to what we're talking about, but and I guess my mind went there because of communication and the long history of communications as a space that is constantly in the front lines of the battle between societies of control and authoritarian regimes and free expression. And so I remember years ago a friend of mine explaining to me that like the earliest hint of the American Revolution, sort of like announcement that was Franklin, Ben Franklin, who had a newspaper, as we all know, and I can't remember the exact year, but something like 1769. So a good number of years before, was warning people about a very specific thing that is in a distant echo related to this, which was the British put in a stamp tax. And the stamp tax was much more insidious than a stamp tax, right? It sounded innocuous, right? It sounded like, oh, you got to pay a little, buy stamps. What it really was about controlling the flow of information, meaning it was about censorship. It was about being able to control the mail system. And Ben Franklin spotted that as an attempt of that regime to interfere in the free expression of people in the colonies because of their fear of what was coming. And he warned the colonies what it really was in like one of his newspaper, broadsheets or whatever they called it that he would put out. And I know this is like obviously literally centuries ago and and metaphorically a millennium ago, but I think it's interesting to keep that in mind, meaning that it is always more than just content moderation. That being the in-between of communication, authoritarian regimes will always want to be the middleman in communications. They will always want to be the mediator, the one who's determining what communications are dangerous or not, which ones are free and not, which ones are terrorists or not, which ones are, because that is an essential part of controlling a society. And you can see this long before Ben Franklin and long after. But that one's interesting because it's pretty close to this. If you look at how the mail system evolved into the telegraph system, the transatlantic cable, and then eventually the global communication system, the internet, that sort of just being in between to make these adjustments has always been a part of the game of authority. And so resisting it now is crucial, because I think we know there is a tsunami of this coming, of AI as the regime that itself as a regime, not a regime behind it, that will be moderating content, to, to use a euphemism, right? It will be really literally moderating life. So the resistance now is crucial. Sorry to go so long.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
just
yeah,
as you
like-
said, it's more than just sorry, Emma, more than just a tax on a stamp. It's more than just the silencing of one message. But for so many artists, if that's where they have thousands of followers that they've dedicated years to cultivating, and then suddenly that account just goes poof, and that's their main source of reaching people, that's an entire livelihood. That's an entire like, social media is becoming more and more important for artists every day, and especially after COVID, especially as the world is recovering in so many ways. So it's so much more than just the sharing of one image. It stands to alter so much more. And as Emma said, like the field of culture, like artistic culture as a whole.
Yeah, and it's not too late. Like, we're still like in the beginning stages of what our future looks like and what art online looks like, and we have to make sure that it's protected and that we have a voice in the matter, because up until now we haven't. But it's not too late for us to have a voice. A lot of this is still very nascent. It's just.
I also want to jump in and answer Clive. Clive asked, what sorts of pressures do you think will cause social media companies to change their moderation policies? I think social media companies don't want to be seen as the bad guy. So with high pressure campaigns, high visibility campaigns like the one that we're in the middle of right now, if we're able to amplify that message of that social media companies are suppressing artistic expression, nobody wants to be associated with that. I think these types of emphasis on bad PR for them would be helpful, and also give them a way that they can help save the day, involve more artists in what they need to do. If we can work with them, sort of infiltrate that way, improve the experience for artists and people who want to see art, then I think that's the way to go. In terms of how individual artists can be involved, your other question, just like I said earlier, pay attention to what's going on in the digital rights community, sign on to the manifesto, help us bring together that support, and apply that pressure on a regular basis.
And talk to people about it outside of the internet, people in your life or at the coffee shop or wherever, explain to them the importance of this. There is such a natural tendency to look at social media and look at real life, and even I struggle to find the right words to describe my life outside of social media other than in real life. But the truth is, it affects my day-to-day. It's affecting my success as an artist, and it's affecting the success of every artist I know. So it's a very real life social media is, and it's detrimental when people seem to think like, oh, well, it's just social media, you can just turn it off. You don't need it. They want to believe that we don't need it, but the truth is we do. So talking to people about it, even people who don't use social media, when you can frame it as, this is a freedom of expression issue, there's a human rights issue, this is a global issue, it's important to find the right ways to frame it.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I'd have a question, or do I have to type it?
You can ask it, right?
Yeah. So I find this all sort of confusing, speaking as an artist and also someone who has looked into sort of the philosophy of art and aesthetics. One of the things that I find kind of confusing about your argument is that when the argument gets a little bit difficult, you seem to lean on the phrase freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm.
And when people bring up, in response to your argument, freedom of speech, you seem pretty quick to delineate different types of speech. And so I'm wondering, could you explain what you consider to be the difference of freedom of expression versus freedom of speech and why you make that distinction?
Maybe, so I don't intentionally use them in different contexts. I've been, and maybe wrongfully use them interchangeably. But I do think, you know, expression covers maybe more broadly different ways that people that speak, different contexts in which speech is emitted. You know, speech isn't just what comes out of my mouth, but it's maybe the clothes I wear or other ways that I express myself. So sometimes when I say I lean on freedom of expression, it means to recognize that speech is enacted in many different forms other than me just talking. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, but the conversation about freedom of speech has a lot of overlapping priorities at times. You know, there's my freedom of speech as an individual that the government, you know, First Amendment, I'm protected by the First Amendment, and the government can't control what I say or limit me from speaking. And then there are these platforms which are owned by private companies, which because they're not government run, these entities, these social media companies have a right of free speech to kind of govern what content gets shared or suppressed. So it's a complicated field, and if you sense any sort of confusion, it's because there's a lot of tensions going on that are oftentimes case specific, and there's a very complicated case law about what types of forums speech happen in, and that can be read in different contexts differently.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up, and then I'll leave it to it. First of all, thanks for that. Do you think the argument you're trying to make relies on some, do you think one can make this argument without artistic exceptionalism? Like there seems to be a sort of a whiff of, as long as it's art, it should enjoy a greater status of protection than if it was not art. Which to some degree, I think intuitively I believe in, but I don't think that I could ever argue for it. And I'm wondering if that idea of artistic exceptionalism is a difficulty for you guys to navigate and how you do that.
I don't want to step over you, Emma, go ahead.
I mean, our goal is to advocate for artists on social media. So that is going to be our objective with the Don't Delete Art campaign in specific. Art is a different category, I think, than other visual media, you know, I mean, Elizabeth, how would you like?
Something I was thinking about adding into this is that artistic expression, including poetry, including literature, including visual art, part of what it is it's subjective in a lot of cases. How it's read, how it is perceived can change drastically on the context, the time period, the locations in which it's shown. And we've seen that so often in the arts in particular. So I don't think I want to say that, you know, because it's art, I don't know that that makes it deserve any greater protection than anything else. But I think the indeterminacy of artistic expression does bear additional attention on this. It's different than, say, you know, a 2,000 word long form op-ed, you know, where people can go in parsing precisely what they're trying to say. Artistic expression, visual art, whatever, there's an openness, right? Is, you know, is an image of a woman topless and screaming different in the context of like a protest versus, I don't know, other contexts. There's a variability there, which I think bears acknowledging and being mindful of, particularly when it comes to censorship of art, is the interpretation of it can change so greatly from how it's shown and where it's shown.
You know, I think one way of, I guess, trying to wrestle with the question that I think Mark is asking is, you know, the censorship of the female nipple versus the male nipple in Instagram or other platforms, and the battle against that censorship, is something that ultimately, you know, we say that social media is a, you know, and the algorithms and AI and all that is an expression of society. So the question is, if we resist that censorship in social media, it would seem that we should be resisting that censorship in life. Meaning, embedded in that is the fact that the absurdity that, you know, men can walk down the street with no shirt on and women can't, or they're not supposed to. And I don't just mean regulations and laws. I'm talking about societal, you know, norms. And so, does this, when I heard Mark say exceptionalism, artistic exceptionalism, so can, you know, the bring this to life? And it's not to say the street is more life than Instagram. It's to say people who aren't artists, right? You know, meaning is the shirt covering the female nipple in Cooper Square the Western hijab? You know, is it a sort of a set of social cultural impositions that determine that one nipple is fine to see and the other's not? It's we have the discussion in art and in Instagram, and what does it mean on the street? If it's an art, like the Cooper Square protest with the photo that you put up by the Cube, ultimately embedded in that, and this goes back in some ways to what some of the 60s was about, wasn't just about that, but it was about a lot of things, is the idea that people should be able to do whatever the fuck they want anywhere. And that those social norms are themselves a problem, whatever media or form of expression or artistic or protest or, you know, ultimately, the reason it's an important protest, that I would say, is that we can get to the point where, you know, those glaring eyes of social norm, you know, the male gaze is, of course, there's lots of forms of power gaze that controls people's behavior in on and out of communication networks. And so I think, you know, my family's from Iran, so I obviously follow the situation over there very closely. And, you know, I think there are, it takes, for the Western mind to try to understand the debate and the violence of the regime in Iran right now. It's very, very difficult unless you live there. And I think doing the mental exercise of identifying our hijabs is an important exercise. And sometimes they're very physical and visceral, as in the female nipple. There are other hijabs that are not physical or not even necessarily visible. But there are lots of forms of hijab throughout the world. And certainly New York City is not exempt from them. So anyway, this is just a little hint of what I think Mark was maybe getting at.
Yeah, I think there's something definitely to that. You know, the context in which we read images online are fed by other contexts in the world outside of the internet. And but fundamentally, if we're not able to express and engage with different ways of communicating, engage with each other on you know the terms that we want to, in the forms that we want to, then something tremendous is lost there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we talk about freedom of expression, you know, it's our right to be able to express ourselves, right? And the most concerning thing to me about badly applied content moderation and not having artists at the table of social media companies is this ripple effect of their decisions impacting the world around us, and the decisions that artists are making outside of the online space that are informed by what they've learned, what they've become influenced by on social media, and what that might mean for our institutions, for our galleries, for the kind of artwork we ultimately get to see, and how that's going to be, how that could be and is controlled by this medium to a certain extent, and without potentially them being nefarious in their intent of how they moderate art. It still can have very negative effects if we don't speak up and make sure that the freedom of expression is valued and protected on these major platforms.
To
I
take
think
another history. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, I think artists are crucially positioned to make the arguments, to make the case. That's why I totally agree. Having artists at the table is essential, because the forms of nuance and imagination that artists hopefully are involved in are exactly what's missing from the streams of censorship. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was recalling something I was studying some years back within the Supreme Court in a case around pornography. And I think the case, if I could be mistaken, but it made its way to the Supreme Court because there was a town that was banning a strip club in the 60s. And it was that, along with like the banner or the billboard of the club itself, and there was something on the billboard, and there was a number of these locations, but when it came to one certain community, that community said, we're not going to allow this place to exist. They tried to fight against the creation of the club. They didn't let it be built, and then the club owners sued them, and eventually worked its way to the Supreme Court. And if I'm not mistaken, the decision ultimately ended up being locations are allowed to decide what they deem pornographic. It's up to the locality, the townships. And the area was so confusing because when Stuart Potter was asked in '64, like there's a very relatively well-known quote. He says, I can't, they ask him, because it's all words, it's all, you got to name it, right? He's like, I can't, if you ask me what the pornography is, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I know it's obscene when I see it, but I can't write it down.
Right.
And this goes down to a lot, I think, the nature of what we're talking about and the fluidity of perception and the degree to which certain individuals are deeming something, obscene or pornographic. That's that uphill cultural battle. I think that is a very interesting part of this discussion.
Yeah, one of the most important one of the 4 factors for the Miller test, which is the test for obscenity, is about the local like relevance, right? Like it's based on what the norms are for this, where this act is taking place, where this image is, where it is. And what happens with social media is globalization, like we were talking about with the nipple guidelines having effects on the way people live their lives in Europe or in other parts of the world. Having a blanket system and how content is moderated and how images are read by a system, and say through AI, and having it come from potentially, the United States, or from moderators who are from cultures who just don't see things the same way other cultures see them. It's very damaging, and that isn't the way that say the Supreme Court has figured out the way that obscenity should be determined. Ultimately, we end up going with the lowest common denominator, which is just like, okay, then no women's bodies. That's a risk.
There's a lot of local groups within the communal social media town squares, air quote. You know, it's not a little town, although again, it's often they're considered to be town squares where people should have the freedom to speak. You know, but it's not that simple. Fundamentally, it's not that simple.
Well, yeah, it's town squares with a top-down content moderation. So that the decisions are not coming from the town square, you know? That's an issue.
That's an important issue.
Well, are there any other questions for Elizabeth? Or is there anything you want to talk about?
Well, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I really, I think it's like an early warning system. I feel like, you know, I feel like there's a big storm coming, and the work that you're all doing is an early hint as to just how intense it's going to get. It's going to get really intense and very, very quickly. I think McCarthy is going to look like a kindergarten compared to where we're going to be in 15, 20 years. And so I think it's incredibly important to early on get these nuanced pieces of the story into the story. So,
Absolutely. And thank you for inviting the opportunity for us to talk more about this. It's a huge part of what we think is important, is just sharing the information. So thank you again for inviting this conversation to happen.
our pleasure, really, our pleasure. Wonderful. Well, we'll see you all again soon.